Welcome to where time falls quiet.
200 years before the flood. The number. Ancient civilizations couldn't forget. What if the number carved into ancient clay wasn't mythology at all? What if it was a timestamp, precise and deliberate, marking something that happened so long ago that we've mistaken memory for fantasy? 241,200 years. That's the figure. Not rounded, not approximate, exact, and it keeps appearing. Imagine holding one of those tablets now. The clay is cool, dense, surprisingly heavy for its size. Your fingers trace the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into its surface more than 4,000 years ago by a scribe whose name we'll never know. The tablet is a fragment of something larger, a king list, an administrative record, a genealogy of power that stretches back beyond the flood. And there, among the names of rulers and the tallies of their reigns, is that number again. 241,200. It doesn't belong, not in the world we've been taught to understand. Human civilization, we're told, began around 5,000 years ago in the river valleys of Mesopotamia and Egypt. Before that, scattered tribes, hunter-gatherers, the slow accumulation of agriculture and pottery. But the Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets discovered in the ruins of ancient Uruk and Nippur, tells a different story. It describes kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years each. Their reigns, when added together, span precisely 241,000. 200 years before a flood reset everything. The academic response has been consistent. Dismiss it. These numbers, we're assured, are symbolic, inflated, the product of priestly exaggeration or scribal error compounded over generations. They can't be literal because they're impossible. And yet, the number persists. It appears not once but across multiple independent sources. Different tablets, different cities, different scribes, all recording the same chronology with bureaucratic precision. The Sumerians didn't treat these figures as myth. They recorded them with the same clinical attention they used for grain stores and temple inventories. Here's what makes it unsettling. The Sumerians were obsessive record keepers. Their mathematics were sophisticated, their astronomy advanced enough to calculate planetary cycles that modern wouldn't confirm until telescopes were invented. They developed the sexagesimal system, base 60, which we still use today to measure time and angles. These weren't primitive storytellers inflating legends around campfires. They were bureaucrats, engineers, astronomers, and they preserved a timeline that reaches back nearly 250,000 years. Now, hold that thought for a moment. 241,200 years. If we subtract that span from the estimated date of the flood, roughly 5,000 years ago according to archaeological evidence from Mesopotamian sediment layers, we arrive at a date roughly 246,000 years before the present. That's deep into the time frame modern associates with anatomically modern humans, but long before any accepted model of civilization, before agriculture, before permanent settlements, before writing, metallurgy, or monumental architecture. And yet, here's a number, precise and deliberate, suggesting that something was happening, something organized, something recordable, in an era we've categorized as prehistory. The number refuses to disappear because it's not alone. It sits within a larger pattern, a chronology that the ancient world seemed determined to preserve, despite its apparent impossibility. The Babylonians inherited the king lists from the Sumerians and continued to copy them. The Assyrians did the same. Even as empires rose and fell, scribes kept transcribing these reigns, these impossible timespans, as though they contained something too important to lose. Why would they do that? Why invest the labor, the clay, the institutional memory to preserve a fiction? Unless it wasn't fiction. Unless the number represented something real, something experienced, recorded, and then misunderstood by later generations who inherited the data but lost the context. What if 241,000, 200 years wasn't the duration of human reigns at all, but a measurement of something else? A cycle, an epoch, an astronomical or geological span that ancient cultures encoded in the only framework they had available: kingship. This is where the silence begins to hum with implication. Because if that number is a timestamp, if it marks an actual event or period, then the foundation of our historical narrative cracks. Civilization doesn't begin 5,000 years ago. It resumes. The cities of Sumer, rising suddenly and fully formed from the floodplains, aren't humanity's first attempt at complexity. They're the second, or the third, or the latest in a series of attempts separated by catastrophe. The king lists don't describe the birth of human governance, they describe its restoration. After the flood, the text says, kingship descended from heaven once again. Not for the first time. Again. The word choice matters. It implies repetition, a return to something that had existed before and been interrupted. The scribes who pressed these words into clay weren't recording the dawn of history. They were recording its reboot. And that number, 241,200, sits at the boundary, marking the division between what was and what came after. It's not random, it's not inflated legend. It's a flag, planted in the timeline, daring us to ask why it's there. Why that specific figure? Why does it appear consistently across sources? And what does it mean if the ancient world was trying to tell us that the history we know is only the most recent chapter in a much longer, much older story? The clay doesn't lie, it remembers. And what it remembers is a number that refuses to be dismissed, a chronology that refuses to be forgotten, and a question that refuses to stay buried. What happened 241,000, 200 years before the flood? The archive rooms of ancient Uruk were not temples. They were not palaces built for ceremony or monuments raised to impress the gods. They were bureaucratic storage facilities, climate-controlled by design, protected from moisture and heat, organized with the precision of a modern library. Inside these rooms, stacked on wooden shelves that have long since turned to dust, were thousands of clay tablets, grain inventories, tax records, legal contracts, and among them, pressed into clay with the same methodical care, were the king lists. Imagine being the archaeologist who first opened one of those sealed rooms. The air inside would have been still, untouched for millennia. The tablets wrapped in the silence of deep time, waiting. You lift one carefully. It's small, no larger than your hand, but dense and surprisingly intact. The cuneiform script is sharp, each wedge-shaped mark deliberate. You recognize the format immediately. It's a genealogy, a succession of rulers. But then you read the numbers. Allulim, the first king, ruled for 28,800 years. Alaljar, the second, 26,400 years. You check the tablet again, you check the translation. The numbers don't change. This is not how myth is recorded. Myths are fluid, poetic, prone to variation across retellings. They shift with the teller, adapt to the audience, evolve over generations. But these tablets don't shift. They're consistent across multiple copies found in different cities, separated by centuries. The Weld Blundell prism, discovered in the early 20th century, lists the same kings, in the same order, with the same reign lengths as fragments found in Nippur and Ur. The scribes weren't embellishing. They were copying from a standard source, preserving a record they believed to be accurate. Here's what makes it extraordinary. The Sumerians had no reason to fabricate these numbers. Their culture valued precision. They invented one of the world's first writing systems specifically to keep records, primarily economic records. Cuneiform emerged not from a desire to tell stories, but from the practical need to track grain shipments, livestock, labor, and tribute. The script itself reflects this utilitarian origin. It's angular, efficient, designed for speed and clarity. When Sumerian scribes wrote, they wrote to document reality. So when they documented kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, they did so with the same clinical detachment they used for warehouse inventories. The text is bureaucratic in tone. It lists each king's name, the city where he ruled, and the length of his reign, then moves to the next entry without elaboration or drama. There are no heroic deeds described, no divine interventions, no moral lessons embedded in the narrative. Just names, cities, and numbers. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alaljar of Eridu, 36,000 years. Enmenluana of Bad Tabira, 43,200 years. The format mirrors the structure of grain receipts and tax ledgers found in the same archives. This is administrative language, not mythology. And then, abruptly, the list marks a division. The text states clearly, "Then the flood swept over." After the flood, kingship descended from heaven. The next king, Jusha of Kish, ruled for 1,200 years, still impossibly long by modern human standards, but drastically reduced compared to the pre-flood rulers. The reigns continue to decrease in subsequent generations until they eventually settle into spans that approach recognizable human lifetimes. But the boundary is explicit. Before the flood, cosmic time. After the flood, diminishing time. The Sumerians saw this as a fundamental divide in their history. Why would they preserve this? If the pre-flood kings were purely mythological constructs, why not simplify them, round them off, make them easier to remember and transmit? Instead, the numbers are jagged, specific, and mathematically precise. 28,800, 43,200. These aren't the clean, symbolic numbers you'd expect from myth. They're the kind of figures you get when you're recording something that was calculated, measured, or derived from a source that demanded accuracy. The clay itself is part of the answer. Unlike papyrus, parchment, or wood, clay is nearly indestructible. Once fired or simply dried in the arid Mesopotamian climate, a clay tablet can survive for thousands of years. Water won't dissolve it. Fire hardens it. Insects won't eat it. The Sumerians understood this. They chose clay deliberately because they wanted their records to endure. They weren't writing for their own generation, they were writing for the future. They were creating a memory that could survive catastrophe. And catastrophe did come. The archaeological record confirms it. Leonard Woolley, excavating the royal tombs of in the 1920s, found a layer of clean, water-deposited sediment nearly 3 meters thick, separating older settlements from newer ones. No artifacts, no pottery, no human activity, just sterile clay laid down by flood. Similar layers have been found at Uruk, Shuruppak, and Kish, all dating to roughly the same period around 5,000 years ago. The flood wasn't a parable. It was a geological event, documented in the stratigraphy of the region and corroborated by the written records that came after it. So the scribes who recorded the king lists weren't inventing a mythological past. They were preserving a chronology that predated the flood, a timeline inherited from earlier records that somehow survived the catastrophe. The tablets themselves might be copies made centuries after the deluge, but the information they contain is older, much older. The king lists represent an attempt by post-flood civilization to reconstruct what came before, using whatever fragments of knowledge remained. The archive rooms of Uruk weren't just storage facilities. They were deliberate acts of memory, institutional efforts to ensure that the knowledge of the past wouldn't be lost again. The Sumerians had experienced what it meant to lose everything, to have a flood erase cities, populations, and the continuity of culture. So they built archives, they trained scribes, they made copies of copies, ensuring redundancy. They understood that memory is fragile, that knowledge can vanish in a single generation if it's not actively preserved. The king lists, with their impossible numbers and clinical precision, were part of that preservation. They were a message sent forward through time, written in clay that could survive anything. And the message is this: we were not the first. There were kings before the kings, rulers who governed in an age so distant that their reigns are measured in tens of thousands of years. We don't know who they were. We don't fully understand what those numbers represent. But we know they existed because the clay remembers. And the clay, unlike papyrus or memory or oral tradition, does not forget. The Sumerian king list doesn't begin with humanity. It begins with something else, something the text itself struggles to categorize, using the only framework available: kingship. But these weren't kings in any sense we understand. They didn't rule cities as administrators or conquerors. They didn't build palaces or wage wars for territory. The text describes them almost reluctantly, as though the scribes knew the words were inadequate but had no better language to convey what they were preserving. Before the flood, the list states, kingship was lowered from heaven, not established, not created, lowered. The verb matters. It implies that governance, order, civilization itself existed somewhere else first, somewhere above, beyond, or outside the human world, and was then transferred to earth. The first king, Allulim, ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. The second, Alaljar, ruled for 36,000 years. 8 kings total, spanning 241,200 years across 5 cities. Then the flood swept over, and everything stopped. This is the boundary, the division the Sumerians marked with absolute clarity. Before the flood, a different order of time, a different category of rule. After the flood, kingship descended from heaven once again, not for the first time, again. The word appears in multiple versions of the list, consistent across translations. It signals repetition, a return to a pattern that had been interrupted. The post-flood kings still ruled for impossibly long spans initially, 1,200 years, 960 years, but their reigns steadily diminished over generations until they approached lifespans we recognize as human. The text documents a gradual descent from cosmic time to mortal time, as though whatever had made the pre-flood reigns possible was slowly fading. But what were those pre-flood rulers? The king list offers no description of no explanation of their origin. It simply records their names and their tenure with bureaucratic detachment. Later Mesopotamian texts, however, provide fragments of context. The Babylonian priest Berossus, writing in the 3rd century before the Common Era, preserved traditions that described the pre-flood period as an era when divine beings, the Apkallu, walked among humans and taught them the arts of civilization. These beings were neither gods nor men, but something in between. Sages, advisors, bringers of knowledge. They established the foundations of culture, then withdrew or were withdrawn when the flood came. The Apkallu appear repeatedly in Mesopotamian iconography, depicted as hybrid figures, sometimes human-headed with fish bodies, sometimes winged, always associated with wisdom and instruction. They're credited with teaching humanity writing, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, law, and architecture. Every essential component of civilization, in other words, was attributed to these pre-flood teachers. The implication is uncomfortable but clear. Humanity didn't invent these things. Humanity received them. Civilization wasn't a gradual development arising from trial and error. It was transmission, education, the passing down of knowledge that already existed in complete form. This is where the king list stops being a simple genealogy and becomes something more troubling. If the pre-flood rulers weren't human, if they represented something else, teachers, sages, or perhaps even symbolic representations of long epochs rather than individuals, then what does their 241,200-year span actually measure? Is it the duration of instruction, the length of an astronomical cycle, the time required for knowledge to be fully transmitted and absorbed before catastrophe made continuation impossible? The text itself provides one clue: the pre-flood cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. These weren't mythical locations. They were real settlements, excavated and confirmed by archaeology. Eridu, in particular, is recognized as one of the oldest continuously inhabited sites in Mesopotamia, with temple structures dating back nearly 7,000 years. The city's foundation myths describe it as the first city ever built, the place where civilization began. But the king list places Eridu in the pre-flood period, which means the city's origins stretch back further than the archaeological record currently acknowledges. Or the city was rebuilt after the flood on the site of something much older. The division in the king list isn't arbitrary. It represents a genuine break in continuity, a moment when the old order ended and the new order began. The flood wasn't just a natural disaster, it was a reset, an event that severed humanity's connection to whatever preceded it. After the deluge, kingship had to descend from heaven again, because the previous system, whatever it was, had been destroyed. The knowledge, the order, the governance that had defined the pre-flood world didn't survive intact. It had to be restored, retaught, re-established. And the lengths of the post-flood reigns suggest that the restoration was imperfect, diminishing with each generation as the memory of what had been grew fainter. This is why the Sumerians preserved the list. They understood that they were living in the aftermath, not the beginning. Their cities, their laws, their writing, none of it was original. It was inherited, recovered from fragments, reconstructed from whatever knowledge survived the catastrophe. The pre-flood rulers, whether they were literal beings or symbolic representations of epochs, embodied a lost completeness. They represented a time when knowledge was whole, when civilization functioned according to principles that later generations could no longer fully grasp. The boundary between pre-flood and post-flood isn't just temporal, it's epistemological. It marks the difference between knowledge possessed and knowledge remembered. Before the flood, direct transmission, full understanding, cosmic timescales. After the flood, fragmented memory, gradual forgetting, mortal lifespans. The Sumerians were acutely aware that they existed on the wrong side of that boundary. They had inherited pieces of something greater, but the whole remained out of reach, separated from them by the floodwaters and the passage of 241,200 years. So when the king list states that kingship descended from heaven, It's not describing the invention of government. It's describing the resumption of order after chaos, the re-establishment of structure after collapse. The pre-flood rulers weren't the first kings. They were the previous kings. The ones who governed before the flood made continuation impossible. And the post-flood rulers weren't founders. They were successors, inheritors of a system that had existed long before they took up the task of preserving it. The text doesn't describe the beginning of human governance. It describes its restoration. And that distinction changes everything. Because if civilization had to be restored, that means it had existed before, fully formed, sophisticated, enduring, and been lost. The 241,200-year span isn't measuring human history. It's measuring the gap between what was and what came after. It's the distance between memory and forgetting, between inheritance and invention, between the kings who ruled in cosmic time and the kings who rule in mortal time. Before the kings were kings, there were rulers whose we can no longer define and whose reigns we can no longer comprehend. But the clay remembers their names, and the clay insists they were real. The numbers in the Sumerian king list aren't random. They're not the product of scribal exaggeration or mythological inflation. When you examine them closely, a pattern emerges, a mathematical structure so precise that it suggests deliberate calculation rather than imaginative storytelling. The pre-flood reigns, those impossible spans of tens of thousands of years, are all multiples of a specific unit, 3,600. The Sumerians called this unit a sar, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Allulim's reign, 28,800 years. Divide by 3,600, and you get 8. Alaljar's reign, 36,000 years. That's exactly 10 sar. Enmenluana, 43,200 years. 12 sar. The pattern continues through all 8 pre-flood kings. Their reigns aren't arbitrary figures inflated by legend. They're precise multiples of a base unit that the Sumerians used for astronomical calculations. This isn't mythology. This is mathematics. And mathematics doesn't lie. The sar itself is significant. 3,600 isn't just a convenient round number. It's deeply embedded in Sumerian cosmology and timekeeping. The Sumerians operated on a sexagesimal system, base 60, which they used for everything from counting to measuring angles. 3,600 is 60 squared. It's the number of degrees in a circle multiplied by 10. It's also closely related to several important astronomical cycles. The precession of the equinoxes completes one full rotation approximately every 25,776 years, and ancient cultures often divided this great cycle into smaller units for calculation purposes. The sar may represent one such subdivision. Now add up the reigns of all 8 pre-flood kings. Allulim, 8 sar. Alaljar, 10 sar. Enmenluana, 12 sar. Enmengal-ana, 8 sar. Dumuzi, 10 sar. Ensipad-zid-ana, 8 sar. Enmendu-ana, 5.5 sar. Ubatutu, 5 sar. The total comes to 66.5 sar. Multiply that by 3,600 and you get 239,400 years. Close, but not quite the 241,200 figure we've been discussing. The discrepancy appears in different versions of the king list. Some manuscripts include minor variations in individual reign lengths, which accounts for the slight difference. But the underlying structure remains consistent. Multiples of 3,600. What does this mean? If the Sumerians were simply inventing mythological kings, why constrain themselves to a specific mathematical framework? Why not use round numbers that would be easier to remember and transmit orally? The answer is that they weren't inventing. They were calculating. Or more accurately, they were preserving calculations made by someone else, recording figures that had been derived through some process they either understood or simply accepted as accurate because the source was authoritative. The Tsar wasn't used exclusively for king lists. It appears throughout Mesopotamian astronomical texts as a unit for measuring long time periods. Babylonian astronomers tracked planetary cycles, lunar eclipses, and stellar positions using the Tsar as a foundational unit. They understood that celestial mechanics operated on timescales far longer than human lifetimes, and they developed mathematical tools to describe those cycles. The pre-flood rains measured in ser suggest that these weren't human lifespans at all. They were astronomical periods, epochs defined by celestial events rather than mortal rulers. This reinterpretation transforms the king list from a genealogy into something closer to a calendar. The 8 pre-flood kings might represent 8 distinct eras or phases within a larger cosmic cycle. Each era measured in Sar corresponded to specific astronomical alignments or phenomena that the ancients tracked with precision. The flood, then, wasn't just a geological event. It was the culmination of a cycle, the completion of a great year that ended one epoch and began another. Kingship descended from heaven again because the celestial clock had reset, initiating a new phase in the cosmic order. The Sumerians weren't alone in thinking this way. Ancient cultures worldwide organized time according to vast cycles that dwarfed individual human experience. The Hindu concept of yugas describes 4 ages of decreasing virtue and increasing chaos, with the complete cycle, a Mahayuga, lasting 4,320,000 years. The Mayans calculated the long count, tracking time through Baktuns and Piktuns, with their current great cycle spanning approximately 5,125 years, but embedded within much longer cosmological frameworks. These systems weren't arbitrary. They were attempts to map human history onto celestial time, recognizing that earthly events corresponded to patterns observable in the heavens. But here's where it becomes unsettling. If the pre-flood kings represent astronomical periods rather than individual rulers, then the Sumerians possessed knowledge of celestial cycles that required centuries, if not millennia, of continuous observation to calculate. The precession of the equinoxes, for instance, takes nearly 26,000 years to complete one full rotation. You can't discover that cycle through casual stargazing or a single lifetime of observation. You need institutional continuity, multi-generational record-keeping, and sophisticated mathematical tools to detect and measure such gradual changes. The Sumerians had all of that. But who taught them? The king list itself provides a clue. The 7 sages, the Apkallu, who served the pre-flood kings, were credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization, including astronomy. These figures weren't portrayed as human. They were described as beings who came from the waters, who possessed complete knowledge, and who deliberately instructed humanity in sciences that would otherwise take ages to develop independently. If the Tsar-based chronology predates the flood, if it represents calculations made before the catastrophe, then the knowledge embedded in the king list is older than Sumerian civilization itself. It's inherited knowledge, preserved through the deluge and encoded into clay by scribes who understood its importance, even if they didn't fully comprehend its meaning. This is why the numbers matter. They're not exaggerations or symbolic gestures. They're data points, measurements of something real that the ancients observed and recorded using the only mathematical framework they had. The 241,200-year figure isn't measuring human history in any conventional sense. It's measuring time itself, cosmic time, Astronomical time, the kind of time that operates on scales so vast that individual human lives become irrelevant. The pre-flood kings, measured in Sar, weren't people. They were epochs, and the flood that ended their reign wasn't just water covering the land. It was the end of an age, marked by celestial mechanics and preserved in mathematics. The Sumerians knew this. They structured their king list according to a system that transcended mythology and entered the realm of. They used multiples of 3,600, not because the number sounded impressive, but because it accurately reflected the calculations they had inherited. The clay tablets that preserve these figures aren't telling stories. They're solving equations. They're answering a question we've only recently learned to ask. How long? How long before the flood? How long did the previous age last? How much time separated the old world from the new? The answer, calculated in SAR and recorded with bureaucratic precision, is 241,000, 200 years. And the mathematics, unlike human memory, doesn't forget. The flood is usually told as a story, a moral fable about wickedness and wrath, an ark and a promise, a symbolic cleansing of the world. But if you strip away the theology and listen carefully to the ground itself, a different voice begins to speak. It is not the voice of myth, it is the voice of sediment. Imagine standing in an excavation trench at Ur, the ancient city that once glittered on the edge of the Euphrates. The sun is harsh, flattening the landscape into blinding light and sharp shadow. Below your feet, the earth has been cut open into a vertical wall of colour and texture. Bands of soil, debris, broken pottery, ash and stone form a stratigraphic tapestry. Each layer is a page of history, stacked patiently on the one below. Archaeologists read this wall like a text. They trace subtle shifts in colour, density and composition, noting where one occupation level gives way to another. Here, a layer of domestic waste suggests sustained habitation. There, a burn layer marks a fire, perhaps a raid or accident. The deeper you go, the older the story becomes, each centimetre representing decades or centuries. And then, beneath the layers of human life, something appears that does not belong to the rhythm of cities. It is a clean, uniform band of silt and clay. No pottery, no tools, no bones, no traces of human occupation at all. Just sterile, water-laid sediment, smooth and undisturbed, extending across the entire excavation area like a line drawn by an unseen hand. Above it, the remains of a bustling city. Streets, houses, temples, graves. Below it, the remnants of an earlier settlement. Between them, silence. The archaeologist's trowel stops. The flood was not metaphor. It was stratigraphy. At Ur, that flood layer is roughly 3 meters thick in places. The material is fine-grained, deposited by slow-moving or receding water rather than a single violent wave. It suggests a prolonged inundation, not just a sudden flash. Radiocarbon dating and ceramic typology place it around the early 3rd millennium before the Common Era, aligning eerily with the period that Mesopotamian texts associate with a great deluge. Similar layers have been identified at Shuruppak, Kish, and other sites along the ancient river plains. Different depths, slightly different dates, but the same pattern. Settlement, silence, settlement again. Text and earth converge. The Sumerian king list is explicit. There were kings before the flood and kings after it. The list marks the flood as a dividing line, a boundary that separates 2 eras of rule. The stratigraphic record mirrors this division with unsettling precision. Below the water-laid sediments, we find earlier architecture and artifacts that predate what we call historical Sumer. Above them, the familiar world of cuneiform, temples, and city-states. The flood, in both clay and soil, is not a symbolic event. It is a geological interruption. But here is where the unease deepens. The pre-flood levels beneath those sediments are not empty. They contain the remains of organized communities, planned building layouts, standardized pottery forms, evidence of early writing or proto-writing in some cases. At Uruk, associated in later tradition with the last pre-flood king, archaeologists have uncovered large, well-constructed houses with multiple rooms, storage facilities, and sophisticated drainage systems. This was not a scattered village. It was a functioning urban centre, and it ended in water. When the floodwaters receded, people returned. They rebuilt on the mud-draped ruins of what had been. In many cases, they reused foundations and walls, raising new structures directly on top of the old. The stratigraphic layers compress catastrophe into a single band, but for the survivors, the experience would have been generational trauma. Imagine losing everything familiar: homes, fields, temples, archives, under a sheet of thick, suffocating silt. Imagine returning and trying to reassemble a life from what little the water had spared. This is where the notion of restoration, not invention, becomes tangible. Post-flood Sumerian civilization did not arise from nothing. It emerged atop the buried memory of an earlier phase of complexity. The flood did not erase humanity. It erased continuity. It cut the thread of institutional memory, shattered archives, drowned libraries, and scattered the custodians of knowledge. The cities that rose afterward were built by people haunted by what had been lost, guided by fragments of instruction preserved in ritual, oral tradition, and whatever physical records survived in sealed containers or high ground. Archaeology reveals this grief in subtle ways: sudden changes in material culture, shifts in settlement patterns, breaks in artistic or technological continuity. All signal that something immense intervened. The fine-grained flood layers act like a curtain, closing one act of human history and opening another. But the actors on both sides of the curtain are not entirely different. They are descendants, inheritors, survivors trying to remember the script of a play whose first half has been washed away. Even the landscape holds the memory. The Mesopotamian plain is an alluvial fan, a vast deposit built over millennia by rivers that flood, shift, and change course. Cities like Uruk, and Lagash rose on slightly elevated mounds, islands in a slow-moving ocean of mud and water. Seasonal flooding was a constant reality, but the event recorded in both sediment and story was different in scale. Its fingerprint is not only local. Around the same broad time frame, other regions show evidence of sudden climatic and hydrological shifts. Lake levels rising, deltas advancing, coastlines redrawn. The earth was not calm. So when ancient texts speak of a flood that swept over the world, destroying cities and erasing their kings, they are not gesturing vaguely at a moral allegory. They are translating into human terms what the land itself experienced: an overrun of boundaries, a collapse of the fragile balance between water and habitation. The language of gods and anger is a way to make sense of what felt like cosmic betrayal. But beneath that language lies the cold, impartial record of stratigraphy. The ground does not care about guilt or innocence. It records only events. Now place this geological reality beside the number that haunts the king lists. 241,000, 200 years before the flood. The deluge marks a transition that we can see and date in the soil. The number marks a span of time that we cannot directly touch, but that the ancients insisted existed before that transition. The flood is the visible seam in the fabric. The 241,200 years are the invisible cloth that came before it. One is sedimentary, the other is mathematical. Both converge on the same hinge in history. This convergence matters because it forces a choice. Either the flood narratives and the stratigraphic evidence describe unrelated events that just happen to align in time and meaning, or they are two perspectives on the same catastrophe. One recorded in mythic language, the other in mud. If they are the same, then the king list's insistence that something substantial lay on the far side of that catastrophe becomes harder to dismiss. The flood did not end a primitive age. It ended an organized one. Archaeologists trained to be cautious often focus on the tangible. Pottery typologies, radiocarbon dates, architectural phases. They catalogue and classify, building careful chronologies from broken shards and decaying walls. But even within that caution, there is an acknowledgement that the early third millennium before the Common Era represents a turning point. Urbanization accelerates, writing systems stabilize, long-distance trade expands dramatically. It is as though human society is picking up momentum after a pause. The pause, preserved as a silent, sterile band of silt, is the flood. Think about what is required to rebuild after such an event, not just physically, but cognitively. Laws must be rewritten or remembered, calendars recalibrated, rituals reconstructed. Agricultural knowledge adapted to altered river courses and soil conditions. In that process, the temptation to claim invention would be strong, to say, "We created this. We are the first." Yet the Sumerians do the opposite. They insist that what they possess was lowered from heaven before, lost, and then lowered again. Their humility is almost accusatory. If they were merely myth-making, why undermine their own claim to originality? The answer may lie in the weight of what they knew they had lost. When you stand in front of that stratigraphic wall, looking at the sterile flood layer that separates two worlds, you can feel it. Above, life. Below, life. Between them, not death, but erasure. The flood as stratification is not just water laid down as sediment. It is amnesia, materialized. It is a physical monument to the fragility of continuity. Everything that isn't carved in stone or baked into clay is vulnerable to that band of silence. The Sumerians responded by turning the earth itself into an archive. They used clay, the very material that once buried their cities, to preserve lists, laws, astronomical observations, and genealogies. They weaponized sediment against oblivion. The king lists, with their impossible chronologies and precise pre-flood spans, are part of that counterattack. By anchoring their memory of the flood in both narrative and number, they ensured that later generations would have to confront the question we face now. If a single geological event could erase an entire chapter of civilization, how many chapters might already be missing? The flood was not a convenience of myth. It was a fact of the ground. And if the ground can bury cities so completely that only a thin band of silt remains to mark their erasure, then the 241,000, 200 years before that band, are not just abstract time. They are a missing library, a lost archive of human, or perhaps more than human, activity that we only glimpse through the stubborn survival of numbers in clay. The flood as stratification is not just a layer of earth. It is a warning carved into the planet itself. Continuity is an illusion. All it takes is water, and the world begins again. The Sumerian king list is not alone. That is what makes it so difficult to dismiss. If it were a singular anomaly, one culture's peculiar obsession with impossibly long chronologies, we could comfortably file it under mythology and move on. But when you step back and survey the ancient world as a whole, you find the same pattern echoing across continents, across civilizations that had no known contact with each other, separated by vast oceans and thousands of years. They all describe the same thing: vast epochs before catastrophe, ages measured in cosmic time, and a moment when everything reset. In India, the concept of yugas divides cosmic history into 4 great ages of declining virtue and increasing chaos. The Satya Yuga, the Golden Age, lasts 1,728,000 years. The Treta Yuga follows for 1,296,000 years. The Dvapara Yuga spans 864,000 years. And the Kali Yuga, the Dark Age we supposedly inhabit now, endures for 432,000 years. The complete cycle, a Mahayuga, totals 4,320,000 years. These numbers aren't symbolic gestures. They're precise calculations embedded in sacred texts like the Mahabharata and the Puranas, preserved through millennia of oral and written transmission. The Hindu chronologies like the Sumerian king lists operate on timescales that dwarf human lifespans. They describe cycles within cycles, great wheels of time turning slowly through ages of order and disorder. At the end of each Mahayuga, the texts describe pralaya, a period of dissolution and renewal, often involving floods, fire, or cosmic upheaval. Sound familiar? The structure is eerily similar to the Mesopotamian division between pre-flood and post-flood eras. Before the catastrophe, cosmic time. After the catastrophe, diminished time, moving steadily toward another reset. Now shift continents. The ancient Egyptians spoke of Zep Tepi, the first time, an epoch when the gods walked the earth and established the principles of civilization. This era preceded dynastic Egypt by an unspecified but immense span. The Turin King List, a fragmentary papyrus dating to the reign of Rameses II in the 13th century, before the Common Era, attempts to catalogue all the rulers of Egypt from the beginning. Before the human pharaohs, the list records the reigns of gods and demigods, whose tenures are measured in thousands of years. The total span from Zep Tepi to the beginning of human kingship is often interpreted as tens of thousands of years, though the exact figures are debated due to damage to the papyrus. Egyptian mythology describes multiple destructions and renewals of the world. The goddess Sekhmet was sent to punish humanity and nearly destroyed them entirely before being stopped. The god Ra grows old and weary, withdraws from direct rule, and the world enters a new phase of diminished divine presence. These narratives parallel the Sumerian structure, an earlier age of direct divine governance, followed by catastrophe, followed by a restoration under different conditions. The pattern repeats with uncomfortable consistency. Cross the Atlantic. The Maya of Mesoamerica developed one of the most sophisticated calendrical systems in the ancient world. Their long count calendar tracks time from a mythological starting point, a creation date corresponding to August 11th, 3114, before the Common Era in our calendar. But the Mayan worldview doesn't stop there. The Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Quiché Maya, describes multiple creations and destructions of the world. Before the current age of humans made from maize, there were earlier attempts. Beings made from mud, then from wood, each destroyed because they failed to honor the gods properly. Each creation is separated by a cataclysm, floods, fire, darkness. The Mayan conception of time is cyclical, not linear. The long count itself is embedded within larger cycles, the Baktun, the Piktun, and beyond. A complete great cycle consists of 13 Baktuns, totaling approximately 5,125 years. But this cycle is just one turn of a much larger wheel. The Mayans tracked cycles extending millions of years into the past and future, suggesting they viewed their own civilization as existing within an immense temporal framework where ages rose and fell according to predictable cosmic patterns. Now consider the Hopi of North America. Their oral traditions describe a succession of worlds, each destroyed when humanity fell out of balance. The first world was destroyed by fire. The second world ended in ice. The third world was consumed by flood. We now live in the fourth world, they say, and its fate depends on whether we maintain harmony with natural and spiritual laws. The pattern is the same. Previous ages, catastrophic endings, new beginnings. The specifics differ, but the structure, the rhythm of rise, fall, and renewal remains constant. How could cultures separated by oceans and millennia describe the same pattern? The standard explanation is convergent mythology. Humans everywhere face the same existential anxieties about death, chaos, and the fragility of order, so they create similar narratives to make sense of these fears. But that explanation begins to strain when the chronologies themselves align not just thematically, but numerically. The Hindu Mahayuga, the Sumerian 241,000, 200 years, the Egyptian tens of thousands of years before dynastic rule. These aren't vague gestures at deep time. They're specific, calculated figures preserved with the same reverence as religious law. There's another possibility, one that requires a different frame. What if these cultures weren't inventing parallel myths independently? What if they were inheriting fragments of the same memory, passed down through lineages so ancient that the original context was lost, leaving only the numbers and the structure? If a global catastrophe occurred, whether geological, climatic, or cosmic, survivors in different regions would carry fragmented memories of what preceded it. Over generations, those memories would be reinterpreted through local languages, symbols, and religious frameworks. But the core structure, the division between before and after, the measurement of vast time, the emphasis on restoration rather than creation, would persist. Geological evidence supports the possibility of such events. The Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,800 to 11,600 years ago, saw rapid and dramatic climate shifts. Temperatures plunged, ice sheets advanced, sea levels changed, and ecosystems collapsed. The cause is still debated: meteorite impacts, volcanic eruptions, shifts in ocean currents. But the effects were global. Human populations were stressed, migration patterns altered, and entire ways of life disrupted. If such an event can leave geological signatures readable today, why wouldn't it leave cultural signatures as well? The convergence of flood myths is particularly striking. From Mesopotamia to India, from Greece to China, from indigenous Australian Dreamtime stories to the narratives of the Andes, nearly every ancient culture describes a great deluge that nearly erased humanity. The details vary: an ark, a mountain, a divine warning, but the framework is identical. Water rises, the world drowns, a remnant survives. Civilization begins again. This isn't convergent anxiety. This is shared memory, filtered through different cultural lenses, but rooted in something experienced. If the flood narratives describe a real event or series of events, then the pre-flood chronologies might also carry truth. The vast timespans, whether measured in yugas, Sa, or the reigns of gods, might represent attempts by post-catastrophe cultures to preserve the memory of how long the previous age endured. They didn't have our dating methods, our stratigraphy, our radiocarbon analysis. They had oral tradition, astronomical observation, and the bureaucratic impulse to record. so they encoded deep time in the only formats available: genealogies, king lists, cosmological cycles. The 241,200-year figure from Sumer isn't an isolated curiosity. It's part of a global pattern of cultures insisting that history is older, deeper, and more cyclical than our current models allow. These cultures weren't naive. They were sophisticated observers of the heavens, meticulous record keepers, and survivors of trauma that shaped their worldview. When they say that ages preceded them, that catastrophe reset the clock, and that knowledge had to be restored rather than invented, perhaps we should listen more carefully. The echoes across oceans aren't coincidences. They're harmonics. Different instruments playing the same note, variations on a theme that predates writing, agriculture, and cities. The theme is this: we are not the first. We are the latest. And the gap between what was and what is contains not emptiness, but the ghost of something vast, measured in spans that still whisper through the myths and mathematics of 100 scattered cultures. The number keeps appearing because the memory refuses to die. Even when the context is lost, the structure remains. Even when the civilizations collapse, the pattern survives. The world has ended before. And the clay, the papyrus, the oral tradition, they all insist it will end again. Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological record like a fully formed thought. There is no gradual build-up, no slow accumulation of techniques and knowledge that we expect from cultural evolution. One moment, the Mesopotamian plain is home to scattered agricultural villages practicing basic farming and making simple pottery. The next moment, historically speaking, there are cities. Not just settlements, but planned urban centers with monumental architecture, complex irrigation systems, standardized weights and measures, astronomical observatories, and a complete writing system. It is as though someone flipped a switch and civilization turned on. This is not how development is supposed to work. We are taught that human progress is incremental: trial, error, refinement, accumulation. Agriculture takes centuries to develop, from wild seed collection to deliberate cultivation. Pottery styles evolve gradually, responding to functional needs and aesthetic preferences. Writing emerges slowly from pictographic tokens to abstract symbols capable of representing complex grammar. Yet in Sumer, all of these elements appear essentially complete within a remarkably compressed time frame around 5,000 years ago. There is no apprenticeship period, no learning curve visible in the stratigraphy. The city of Uruk provides the clearest example. By 3,400 before the Common Era, Uruk was already a sprawling metropolis covering nearly 6 square kilometers, with a population estimated between 40,000 and 80,000 people. Its temples were massive, constructed with sophisticated knowledge of load-bearing architecture and decorated with elaborate mosaics. The city had administrative districts, craft workshops organized by specialization, long-distance trade networks reaching from the Indus Valley to Anatolia, and a fully functional writing system capable of recording everything from grain inventories to literary compositions. This level of complexity doesn't arise overnight, yet archaeologically it appears to do exactly that. The conventional explanation is that we simply haven't found the earlier stages yet. That somewhere beneath the oldest levels of Uruk, or buried in unexcavated sites, there must be evidence of gradual development. But decades of intensive excavation across Mesopotamia have failed to produce that evidence. The earliest levels we find already show sophistication. The pottery is wheel-thrown and fired at controlled temperatures. The architecture employs standard modular brick sizes and advanced construction techniques. The irrigation canals demonstrate understanding of hydrology and engineering. These aren't the fumbling first attempts of people learning. These are the confident actions of people who already know. Now consider the writing. Cuneiform script appears around 3200 before the Common Era in a form that is already systematic and functional. Yes, the earliest tablets are primarily administrative, lists of goods, workers, animals, but the system itself is complete. The symbols are standardized. The grammar is consistent. The scribes know how to represent abstract concepts, not just concrete objects. This suggests that writing didn't develop in Sumer. It was introduced there, possibly adapted from an earlier prototype that hasn't survived or hasn't been recognized. The Sumerians themselves would agree with that assessment. Their own texts repeatedly emphasize that they did not invent their civilization, they inherited it. The Eridu Genesis, one of the oldest Sumerian creation texts, describes how the gods established the first cities and granted humanity the arts of civilization before the flood. After the deluge, these gifts had to be restored, lowered from heaven once more. The king lists, as we've seen, make the same claim. Kingship descended from heaven, was interrupted by the flood, then descended again. The language is explicit. This is not invention. This is transmission. The same pattern appears in their mathematics. By the time we have written records, Sumerian mathematicians were working with sophisticated concepts: place value notation, abstract variables, algebraic problem solving, geometric principles. Tablets like Plimpton 322 demonstrate knowledge of Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. These aren't elementary calculations being worked out for the first time. These are refined techniques being applied to complex problems. The mathematics is already mature when it enters the written record, suggesting it existed in some form before writing captured it. Astronomy tells the same story. The Sumerians tracked planetary movements with precision, calculated eclipse cycles, and maintained detailed observational records that later cultures would copy and build upon. The Babylonians, inheriting Sumerian astronomical knowledge, could predict lunar eclipses decades in advance. This level of accuracy requires generations of continuous observation and data collection. Yet when we look for the developmental phase, the centuries of incremental skywatching that should precede such mastery, we find very little. The knowledge appears already advanced when we first encounter it. This pattern of premature sophistication is what you'd expect from inheritance rather than invention. When knowledge is transmitted from a previous source, it arrives complete, but without the underlying framework that originally produced it. The recipients possess the techniques, but not necessarily the theory. They can perform the calculations, but might not fully understand the principles. They apply the methods because they work, not because they derive them independently. This creates a strange archaeological signature, capabilities that seem anachronistic, technologies that appear ahead of their time, knowledge that seems borrowed from a context we can't access. The Sumerian language itself is an isolate. It has no known relatives, no linguistic family, no evolutionary lineage we can trace. It stands alone, fully formed, with a complex grammar that combines agglutinative and inflectional features in ways that don't match the patterns of surrounding language groups. Linguists can't connect it to any other known tongue, living or dead. It's as though it appeared complete, without ancestors. Languages don't normally work that way. They evolve from earlier forms, branch from common roots, influence, and are influenced by neighbors. But Sumerian just is, stubbornly refusing to fit into the evolutionary models we use for understanding linguistic development. Now step back and look at the complete picture. A language with no known origin. a writing system that appears functional rather than developmental. Mathematics and astronomy operating at levels that require long periods of refinement. Cities that emerge planned rather than organically grown. Administrative systems that function efficiently from their earliest appearance. All of this concentrated in southern Mesopotamia within a few centuries of the flood layers that mark the stratigraphic division between earlier and later settlements. It reads like restoration, not foundation. It looks like people rebuilding something they remember or implementing instructions they inherited, rather than inventing from scratch. The Apkallu traditions make more sense in this light. If pre-flood sages taught humanity the essentials of civilization, writing, mathematics, law, astronomy, agriculture, architecture, then what the Sumerians possessed wasn't their own invention. It was curriculum. They were students, not pioneers. And like all students, they preserved what they were taught with a mixture of understanding and rote memorization. Some principles they grasped fully. Others they applied successfully without fully comprehending the underlying theory. The uneven distribution of knowledge, deep expertise in some areas, surprising gaps in others, is exactly what you'd expect from inherited rather than invented civilization. This realization is profoundly unsettling because it undermines the narrative of human progress we've built our self-image upon. We like to think we climbed from darkness to light through our own cleverness, that every advance was earned through hard-won trial and error. But what if that's not entirely true? What if the foundations were laid by others, and what we call invention is actually recovery? What if the Sumerians were doing exactly what they said they were doing? Restoring something that had been lost, copying from templates that predated the flood, preserving knowledge they recognized as more ancient than themselves. The 241,200-year chronology makes more sense in this context. It's not measuring the age of Sumerian civilization. It's measuring the age of the knowledge Sumerian civilization inherited. The pre-flood span represents the duration of whatever system produced the mathematics, the astronomy, the urban planning, the writing that post-flood cultures scrambled to preserve and implement. The flood didn't destroy humans. It destroyed continuity. It broke the chain of transmission, forcing survivors to reconstruct from fragments what had once been whole. The Sumerians were inheritors, not inventors. Their cities rose on the bones of older settlements. Their knowledge came from sources they acknowledged but couldn't fully explain. Their king lists preserved chronologies they didn't witness but refused to abandon. They understood themselves to be part of a longer story, a later chapter in a history that stretched back further than the flood could erase. And if they were right, if civilization is restoration rather than invention, then everything we think we know about the beginning shifts. Because the beginning we can see is not the beginning. It's just the most recent restart. What if the gods were never gods at all? What if the names we translate as deities, the beings we interpret as supernatural entities demanding worship, were actually something else entirely? Titles, functions, or measurements, encoded in the only language available to preserve them. This isn't blasphemy, it's translation. And it forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about what we think ancient texts are actually saying. Consider the Anunnaki. In Sumerian and Akkadian mythology, they are described as a group of deities associated with fate, judgment, and the underworld. Later interpretations have turned them into extraterrestrials, alien geneticists, or literal gods who ruled before stepping back from human affairs. But strip away the theological and speculative layers and look at how they function in the texts. They appear in administrative contexts. They are numbered, sometimes 7, sometimes 50, sometimes more depending on the source. They are associated with specific celestial bodies, specific time periods, specific functions within the cosmic order. They behave less like personalities and more like categories. The same pattern appears with the Apkallu, the 7 sages who served the pre-flood kings. These beings are credited with teaching humanity the arts of civilization, but they are always exactly 7, not 6, not 8, 7. The number is consistent across multiple sources and traditions. Why? Because 7 isn't arbitrary in Mesopotamian cosmology. It corresponds to the 7 visible celestial bodies known to ancient astronomers: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. These 7 wanderers against the fixed stars structured the ancient understanding of time and fate. They marked days, months, omens, and cycles. The Apkallu as 7 might not represent 7 individuals. They might represent the 7 planetary influences, the 7 timekeepers, the 7 measurable cycles that govern earthly events. This reinterpretation transforms the entire framework. If the Anunnaki, the Apkallu, and other divine figures in Mesopotamian texts are actually encoding astronomical or temporal information, then the narratives aren't mythology in the way we typically understand it. They're data storage. They're mnemonic devices designed to preserve complex information about celestial mechanics, calendrical systems, and cyclic patterns in a format that could survive oral transmission and cultural disruption. The gods aren't beings. They're variables in an equation describing cosmic time. Look at the Sumerian word for god, Dingir. It's represented by a star symbol in cuneiform, not metaphorically, literally. The same symbol that means God also means star or heaven. The boundary between divinity and astronomy is linguistically blurred. When a text says kingship descended from heaven, is it describing a supernatural event? Or is it saying that the system of governance was calibrated according to celestial observations? When it says the gods granted humanity wisdom, is it describing divine intervention? Or is it preserving the memory that knowledge of the heavens, astronomy, mathematics, timekeeping, was the foundation of civilization? The pre-flood kings, with their reigns measured in multiples of 3,600 years, the Tsar, fit perfectly into this model. They aren't human rulers with impossibly long lifespans. They're astronomical epochs, periods defined by specific celestial configurations or cycles. Each king represents a Tsar, a complete rotation of some cosmic wheel. The flood that ends their reign isn't divine punishment. It's the completion of a great cycle, a predictable event that ancient astronomers knew would come because they had calculated it. The catastrophe was written in the stars long before it manifested in water. This approach isn't unprecedented. Modern astronomers have decoded ancient eclipse predictions, planetary tables, and precession calculations embedded in texts that scholars once dismissed as purely mythological. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, for instance, record planetary positions with such precision that modern software can replicate their observations and confirm their accuracy. These weren't primitive superstitions. They were scientific records dressed in the narrative clothing necessary to ensure their preservation and transmission across generations, who might not understand the mathematics, but could memorize the stories. The Hebrew term Elohim presents a similar puzzle. It's grammatically plural, gods, not God, yet often used with singular verbs in biblical texts. Traditional theology explains this as a royal plural, or a reference to the Trinity, but linguistically, it creates tension. What if Elohim, like Dingir, originally referred not to supernatural beings, but to celestial powers, the plural forces governing cosmic order? The term appears in contexts involving creation, judgment, and the establishment of natural law, precisely the domains where ancient cultures encoded astronomical knowledge. The gods who set the boundaries of the sea and command the seasons aren't personalities. They're personifications of natural cycles observable in the heavens. Even the concept of divine kingship takes on new meaning in this framework. Kings weren't claiming to be gods in the modern sense of supernatural beings. They were claiming to rule in accordance with cosmic order, to embody the alignment between earthly governance and celestial time. Their legitimacy derived from their ability to maintain that alignment, to ensure the calendar stayed synchronized with the seasons. The rituals occurred at astronomically significant moments. The agricultural cycles matched the movements of stars and planets. A king who lost that synchronization lost divine favor, which is another way of saying he lost his ability to predict and manage the relationship between human activity and natural cycles. The 241,200-year chronology, when viewed through this lens, isn't measuring reigns of individual rulers. It's measuring a complete astronomical cycle, perhaps multiple precessional periods, perhaps a grand conjunction of multiple planetary cycles, perhaps something even more complex that ancient astronomers tracked, but whose significance we've lost. The number appears because it represents something real and measurable in the sky. The gods who ruled during that span weren't beings. They were the markers, the way stations, the observable phenomena that structured time before the flood reset the system. This raises a provocative question. If the gods were measurements, who were the astronomers? Who possessed the knowledge and institutional continuity necessary to track cycles spanning tens of thousands of years? The answer the texts provide is consistent. The pre-flood sages, the Apkallu, the divine kings, the beings from before. But if those figures are also astronomical code, we're left with a recursive loop. The measurements point to measurers, but the measurers dissolve into measurements when examined closely. Unless, and this is where speculation becomes necessary, the measurers were a civilization we can no longer access directly, one whose institutional knowledge survived the flood only as encoded data embedded in myths, king lists, and astronomical tables. The Sumerians, Babylonians, Egyptians, and other ancient cultures weren't creating gods from scratch. They were inheriting a framework, a system for organizing cosmic time and natural cycles that predated their civilizations. They personified that framework because personification is how pre-literate or early literate cultures store complex information. You can't remember a trigonometric function across generations, but you can remember a story about a god who does specific things at specific times. The narrative becomes the archive. The myth becomes the database. This is why the gods have such specific attributes, domains, and numbers associated with them. Inanna isn't just love and war. She's Venus, the morning and evening star whose 8-year cycle creates a pentagram pattern in the sky. Enki isn't just wisdom and water. He's associated with the constellation Aquarius and the mathematical principles governing irrigation and measurement. Marduk rises to supremacy in Babylon when Jupiter becomes the dominant planet in Babylonian astronomical focus. The gods map precisely onto celestial objects and their cycles because that's what they are, symbolic containers for astronomical data. When ancient texts describe gods teaching humanity, what they're actually preserving is the memory that astronomical knowledge, the ability to measure time, predict seasons, calculate eclipses, understand precession, was the foundation of civilization. That knowledge didn't emerge gradually from naked-eye stargazing. It required instruments, records, mathematical frameworks, and institutional continuity. It required exactly the kind of sophisticated culture the pre-flood chronologies describe. The gods descended from heaven because the knowledge came from sky watching. Kingship descended from heaven because legitimate rule depended on celestial synchronization. The 241,000, 200 years before the flood, might represent the span during which this astronomical knowledge was accumulated, refined and applied. It's the duration of the great experiment, using celestial mechanics to structure civilization, to build cities aligned with stars, to create calendars that could predict not just seasons, but deeper cycles of climate, catastrophe, and renewal. The flood ended the experiment, but the data survived in fragments, in king lists measured in Sa, in myths about gods who ruled before humans, in astronomical tables that preserve calculations older than the cultures copying them. The gods were never gods in the way we think of them now. They were the language ancient people used to speak about, forces they understood empirically, but couldn't explain mechanistically. They were measurements given names, cycles given personalities, mathematical relationships given narratives. And when we translate those narratives back into the astronomical and mathematical frameworks they encoded, a different history emerges. Not one of supernatural intervention, but one of sophisticated observation. Not one of divine rule, but one of cosmic calibration. The gods were measurements. And the measurements tell us that someone, somewhere, was watching the sky and counting time long before the flood washed the counters away. The Great Pyramid of Giza does not speak. It has no inscriptions on its exterior walls, no hieroglyphic declarations of the pharaoh who supposedly built it, no religious texts carved into its corridors. For a structure that dominates the landscape and represents one of the most ambitious construction projects in human history, its silence is deafening. This absence isn't accidental, it's deliberate, and it forces a question that echoes through the empty chambers. What if the pyramid wasn't built to glorify a king, but to preserve something that words couldn't adequately contain? Descend through the original entrance, the narrow passage cut into the northern face at an angle of 26 degrees. The corridor is precise, carved through solid limestone with tolerances measured in fractions of millimeters. You move hunched, the weight of millions of tons of stone pressing down from above. The air is cool, still, untouched by the desert heat. There are no paintings here, no decorations, no evidence of ritual use. Just geometry, just stone configured according to mathematical relationships that reveal themselves slowly, reluctantly, to those who measure carefully. The king's chamber, as it's misleadingly called, sits at the heart of the structure. The granite walls are polished to a mirror finish, fitted together with such precision that you cannot slip a razor blade between the blocks. The chamber's dimensions follow specific ratios. The golden proportion appears in the relationship between length and width, and the chamber's volume relates to its surface area in ways that mirror complex geometric constants. This isn't decoration. This is encoding. The pyramid's interior is a three-dimensional mathematical statement, its proportions and alignments preserving relationships that require no translation because they exist independent of language. Now consider the external measurements. The pyramid's base covers 13 acres, with each side originally measuring 756 feet. The sides are aligned to the cardinal directions, north, south, east, west, with an accuracy of 1/15 of a single degree. This level of precision requires astronomical observation and sophisticated surveying techniques. The ancient Egyptians, we're told, achieved this with copper tools, wooden measuring rods, and sighting stakes. Perhaps, But the consistency of that precision across a structure containing approximately 2,300,000 individual stone blocks suggests something more systematic than trial and error. The pyramid's height, originally 481 feet before the outer casing was stripped, relates to its base perimeter in a way that encodes pi, the ratio of a circle's circumference to its diameter. The slope of the faces, approximately 51 degrees and 51 minutes, creates a relationship between height and base that mirrors the mathematical constant. This could be coincidence, except that the same mathematical relationships appear throughout the structure in the angles of the internal passages, in the dimensions of the chambers, in the positioning of the so-called air shafts that point toward specific stars. Those shafts are particularly telling. They're too narrow for human passage and serve no obvious ventilation purpose, yet they're angled with precision toward specific points in the sky. The southern shaft from the king's chamber targets the constellation Orion, specifically the star Al-Nitak in Orion's belt. The northern shaft points toward Thuban, which served as the pole star around 4,500 years ago when the pyramid was supposedly built. The southern shaft from the Queen's chamber aligns with Sirius, the brightest star in the night sky and astronomically significant to Egyptian cosmology. These aren't decorative choices, they're celestial markers, encoding specific astronomical knowledge into stone. The pyramid's location itself is mathematically significant. It sits at the geographical center of Earth's landmass, the point where the most land meets in all directions. This positioning couldn't have been determined by ancient surveyors using available technology unless they possessed knowledge of global geography that shouldn't have been accessible in the third millennium before the Common Era. Yet there it stands, precisely positioned as though someone had access to a complete map of Earth's continents and calculated the optimal placement. The structure doesn't just encode mathematics and astronomy, it encodes geography. The conventional narrative attributes the pyramid to Khufu, a 4th dynasty pharaoh whose reign is dated to approximately 4,500 years ago. But the only evidence linking Khufu to the structure is a set of quarry marks found in relieving chambers above the king's chamber, marks that some researchers argue were forged in the 19th century by European explorers seeking to claim credit for identifying the pyramid's builder. The pyramid itself contains no contemporaneous inscriptions identifying its purpose or creator. It simply exists, massive and silent, refusing to conform to our expectations of what a tomb should look like. Tombs announce themselves. They're filled with texts describing the deceased's journey to the afterlife, prayers for their preservation, depictions of their accomplishments and lineage. The Valley of the Kings, where pharaohs were actually buried, overflows with such declarations. Every surface is covered with hieroglyphs and images serving religious and commemorative functions. But the Great Pyramid offers none of this. Its chambers are bare. Its passages are unadorned. If it's a tomb, it's the strangest tomb ever constructed. One that seems designed to preserve not a body, but information. The structure's resonant properties add another layer. The king's chamber, when tested with acoustic equipment, shows a fundamental resonance frequency of approximately 110 Hz, a frequency associated with human brain states and used in some meditative and ritual practices. The granite beams above the chamber form a configuration that some engineers argue serves as a resonance amplifier. Was the chamber designed to produce specific acoustic effects? If so, for what purpose? The silence in the pyramid is not empty, it's waiting. It's structured to interact with sound, with frequency, with vibration in ways that suggest function beyond mere burial. Now, connect this to the broader pattern we've been tracing. The Sumerian king lists encode astronomical cycles in mythological narratives. The global flood traditions preserve the memory of catastrophe in story form. The pre-flood chronologies measure time in mathematical units designed to survive cultural disruption. And here in Egypt, we find a structure that encodes mathematics, astronomy, geography, and possibly acoustic principles in stone, the most durable medium available. The pyramid is doing the same thing the king lists did, preserving knowledge in a format that transcends language, culture, and time. This is archive architecture. It's the ultimate backup system for a civilization that understood its vulnerability to erasure. Clay tablets can survive thousands of years, but they can be shattered, burned, or buried beyond recovery. Oral traditions persist across generations, but they mutate, simplify, and eventually fade. Stone, however, stone configured according to mathematical relationships that require no interpretation, stone can endure almost indefinitely. The relationships encoded in the pyramid's proportions will remain true whether future discoverers speak Egyptian, English, or a language that hasn't been invented yet. Mathematics is universal. Geometry is universal. Astronomy is universal. By encoding knowledge in these forms, the builders created a message that could theoretically be decoded by any sufficiently advanced culture, regardless of cultural context. The 241,200-year chronology finds its architectural expression here. If that span represents the duration of astronomical observation, accumulated knowledge, and institutional continuity before the flood, then the pyramid represents the attempt to preserve that knowledge's essence in imperishable form. The structure doesn't tell stories. It solves equations. It demonstrates relationships. It points to the stars and says, "We knew. We measured. We understood that time operates on scales that dwarf individual lives and single civilizations. And we built this to ensure that understanding would survive, even if we did not." The silence inside the pyramid is not the silence of death. It's the silence of mathematics waiting to be read, of geometry waiting to be measured, of astronomical alignments waiting to be confirmed. It's the silence of knowledge stored in the most secure format imaginable. Relationships between mass, angle, distance, and direction that persist, regardless of who interprets them or when. The pyramid doesn't need hieroglyphs because hieroglyphs are language dependent. It doesn't need inscriptions because inscriptions can be misread, mistranslated, or deliberately altered. It needs only to be measured carefully by anyone capable of understanding what measurements mean. And what do those measurements say? They say that the builders possessed knowledge of Earth's dimensions, celestial mechanics, harmonic frequencies, and geometric constants that we associate with advanced mathematics and astronomy. They say that this knowledge was considered important enough to encode in 6 million tons of precisely cut and positioned stone. They say that the structure's purpose transcends the commemoration of a single ruler and enters the realm of institutional memory, a civilization's attempt to preserve its greatest achievements in the face of catastrophe it knew, or suspected, would come. The pyramid stands as proof that calculation, not superstition, guided ancient minds. That precision, not approximation, defined their work. That knowledge, not ignorance, shaped their monuments. The silence inside is not empty. It calculates. It measures. It waits for those patient enough to listen with instruments instead of ears, to read with mathematics instead of eyes. And what it preserves, encoded in stone that will outlast our own civilizations, is a memory of when humanity, or something before humanity, watched the stars, counted the years, and built accordingly. The 241,000, 200 years before the flood whisper through the pyramid's geometry, a chronology too vast for words but perfectly suited for stone. The 241,200 years before the flood is not just a number from ancient texts. It's a warning encoded in clay, preserved through catastrophe, and handed down across millennia by cultures that understood something we're only beginning to grasp. Civilization is not permanent. It rises, flourishes, and falls according to patterns that operate on timescales far longer than individual human memory. The cycle doesn't care about our sense of progress or our belief in linear advancement. It turns regardless, indifferent to the empires built upon its surface. Imagine standing in the ruins of Uruk today. The city that once housed tens of thousands, that pioneered writing and law and urban planning, is now a field of eroded mud brick mounds in the Iraqi desert. Wind-carved walls hint at the grandeur that was, but the streets are empty, the temples silent, the libraries long since dissolved into dust. This is what happens when the cycle turns. Not suddenly, not dramatically, just gradually, inevitably, as water finds the weakest points and time grinds down even the hardest stone. Uruk's fall took centuries, but from the perspective of deep time, it happened in an instant. The Sumerian king list teaches us that this has happened before. The pre-flood civilization, whatever it was, achieved a level of sophistication that required 241,200 years to develop. That's not speculation. That's what the mathematics embedded in the chronology suggests. Astronomical knowledge accumulates slowly, requiring generations of continuous observation. Mathematical systems refine over centuries of application. Institutional memory builds across millennia of stable cultural transmission. The pre-flood span represents the duration necessary to achieve what the post-flood inheritors possessed: complete calendrical systems, sophisticated geometry, predictive astronomy, urban planning principles, and codified law. Then the flood came, not as divine punishment, but as geological inevitability. The climate shifted, the waters rose, the carefully constructed cities, the meticulously maintained archives, the institutional structures that had preserved and transmitted knowledge for thousands of years, all of it disrupted, scattered, or destroyed. What survived was fragmentary. Oral traditions, portable artifacts, whatever knowledge individuals could carry in their memories. The survivors rebuilt, but they rebuilt from pieces. They inherited a system they couldn't fully reproduce, preserved data they couldn't entirely comprehend, and venerated technologies they could copy but not independently derive. This is the pattern. Rise, plateau, disruption, fall, fragmented recovery. The Hindu yugas describe it, the Mayan cycles predict it, the Egyptian Zep Tepi acknowledges it, global flood myths commemorate it, and the Sumerian chronology quantifies it with mathematical precision. Civilization is cyclical, not because of mystical forces or divine intervention, but because the conditions that enable complex societies, stable climate, predictable resources, continuous institutional memory, are themselves subject to disruption. When those conditions collapse, so does complexity. What remains afterward depends on what knowledge formats survive the transition. Now, apply this understanding to our own moment. We live in an age of unprecedented complexity. Global supply chains connect continents. Digital networks transmit information at light speed. Scientific knowledge accumulates faster than any individual can absorb. We've built a civilization that depends on continuous electrical power, functioning satellites, stable internet infrastructure, and just-in-time logistics. Remove any one of these elements, and the system begins to degrade. Remove several simultaneously, and the cascade accelerates beyond control. We are more sophisticated than any previous human culture, but we are also more fragile. Consider what would survive if our civilization experienced a disruption comparable to the ancient flood. Not necessarily water this time, perhaps electromagnetic pulse, solar storm, pandemic, climate cascade, or any of the other low probability but high consequence events that historians and scientists periodically warn about. Our knowledge exists primarily in digital formats: hard drives, servers, cloud storage, all of it dependent on electrical infrastructure and specialized equipment to access. If that infrastructure fails for an extended period, the knowledge becomes inaccessible. Within a generation, it could become incomprehensible. Within several generations, it could be forgotten entirely. The ancients understood this vulnerability. That's why they used clay, stone, and oral tradition, formats that don't require technological infrastructure to access. A clay tablet remains readable 4,000 years later because reading it requires only eyes and knowledge of the script. A stone monument preserves its proportions indefinitely because measuring it requires only basic tools and mathematical understanding. These formats are resilient precisely because they're low-tech. They survive the collapse of the civilizations that created them. Our formats, for all their capacity and speed, do not share that resilience. The 241,200-year chronology teaches us humility. It reminds us that vast spans of time preceded us, that sophisticated cultures rose and fell before the ones we study in history books, that the archaeological record we possess represents only the most recent chapter in a much longer story. If a civilization capable of astronomical calculation, urban planning, and mathematical sophistication could be reduced to fragmentary legends and ambiguous ruins, what makes us think ours is immune to the same fate? We are not the pinnacle of human achievement. We are the latest attempt, building on foundations we only partially understand, inheriting knowledge we didn't generate, confident in a permanence that history repeatedly disproves. The cycle also teaches us about the of-knowledge preservation. The Sumerians, aware of their own vulnerability, created redundancy. They made multiple copies of important texts. They distributed them across different cities. They trained scribes to maintain accurate transmission. They built structures aligned to celestial markers that would remain valid regardless of cultural continuity. They understood that preserving knowledge across catastrophic disruption requires deliberate strategy, multiple formats, and the humility to recognize that what you know might be more valuable than who you are. The king lists survive not because they glorify Sumerian achievement, but because they preserve data the Sumerians recognized as more ancient and important than themselves. We could learn from this. If we took seriously the possibility that our own civilization might face disruption, we would invest in knowledge preservation strategies that don't depend on continuous technological infrastructure. We would create physical archives using durable materials. We would encode essential information in multiple formats. We would ensure that critical knowledge, mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, medicine, engineering principles, exists in forms accessible without electricity or specialized equipment. Some efforts along these lines exist: seed vaults, knowledge repositories, instructions etched in metal. But these remain fringe projects, not civilizational priorities. We act as though permanence is guaranteed, despite all historical evidence to the contrary. The flood that ended the pre-flood era was not unique. Geological and climatic disruptions occur regularly on timescales longer than written history. The Younger Dryas event 12,000 years ago. The Bronze Age collapse 3,000 years ago. The fall of Rome. The collapse of the classic Maya. Each represents a moment when complexity exceeded its sustainable threshold and the system reset to a lower level. Some knowledge survived these transitions. Much did not. The survivors rebuilt with what they could salvage, often worshipping as gods or magic the technologies they no longer understood how to reproduce. We see this pattern in cargo cults, in myths of golden ages, in traditions of divine instruction. They're all pointing to the same reality. After collapse, what remains is memory without context, data without comprehension, technique without theory. The 241,200 years matter because they represent the full cycle, not just the catastrophe, but the vast duration preceding it. The span required to accumulate knowledge, develop institutions, refine techniques, and achieve the sophistication that later cultures would struggle to restore. If we accept that such a cycle existed once, we must accept that it could exist again. That our own accumulation of knowledge, institutional development, and technological refinement operates within a larger pattern. Vulnerable to disruption, we can neither predict nor prevent with certainty. The question isn't whether the cycle will turn again. The question is what we're doing to ensure that when it does, something essential survives. Stand again at that stratigraphic wall, looking at the flood layer that divides two worlds. Above it, the familiar civilization of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, the cultures we study and partially understand. Below it, fragments and hints of something older, more elusive, preserved only in mathematical echoes and mythological memory. Between them, silence. That silence is coming for us too, eventually. Not tomorrow, perhaps not for centuries. But it's coming, because the cycle always turns. What we choose to preserve, how we choose to encode it, and whether we have the humility to recognize our place in a pattern larger than ourselves, these decisions will determine what future archaeologists find when they dig through our ruins, searching for answers to questions we should be addressing now. The clay remembers. The stone endures. The cycle teaches. Whether we're willing to learn is the question that echoes through 241,200 years of forgotten time, waiting for an answer we haven't yet provided.
If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, subscribe, and activate notifications so you don't miss our next videos.